Marbury Education, A2 Sociology, Unit 4, Crime and Deviance, Functionalism. Durkheim, The Rules of Sociological Method, 1895, and The Division of Labour in Society, 1893. In his book The Rules of Sociological Method, Durkheim distinguished between the normal and the pathological. To most of us, pathological means something destructive or harmful, and as such we might think that crime is just that. Crime is socially destructive because it breaks up communities and is harmful to us as individuals when we become victims of it. But for Durkheim it wasn't that simple, and crime could actually be something desirable, functional, and when at a certain level where it wasn't too high and it wasn't too low, it was an indicator of a healthy society. Durkheim starts out by saying that the majority of interested observers seem to think that crime is always a bad thing. One might argue that this is still the dominant view today, as those on the left and the right seek to control or reduce it. On the left, well, they advocate economic redistribution and more jobs, while those on the right seek tougher punishment for offenders and more swift and certain justice. Ideally, both somehow have dreams about eradicating crime, but not for Durkheim. He argues that crime occurs in all societies. It has always been that way, and it will continue to be so. For him, man's behaviour has always attracted some kind of penal repression, what we might call judgment and punishments. So those who constitute society, the conscience collective, have always sought to decide what's criminal, and this changes over time and between different societies. Only when the rate of crime becomes unusually high does he say that it becomes abnormal or pathological. One way that Durkheim explains the universal and relative nature of crime is to imagine a society of saints. The saints don't seek to harm anyone, or steal, or do anything we might view as a crime. Yet this perfect cloister of exemplary individuals, as he describes them, would respond to the most trivial of infractions with the same degree of disgust or disapproval that we would of a murder or rape. If this tells us anything about the nature of crime, it tells us that no matter how hard politicians and other policymakers try, crime will always be with us. If crime were to stop, we would just evolve new sentiments and pass new laws that made merely deviant behaviour, like bad taste, a criminal matter. Durkheim then turns his attention to explaining why criminal acts are committed. He uses more complex language, but essentially he is saying that our individual circumstances, our historical experiences, our genes and other influences mean that our attitudes towards things like behavioural standards or morality won't be the same. So there are plenty of people who differ in their attitudes to the collective or average type. So we can't all think and act in the same way. So some members of society will engage in what the majority view as criminality. Then he says, the collective sentiment cannot and should not be too strong. The collective sentiment refers to the intensity of moral and legal controls placed upon us by authority. They should only have a moderate energy. If too strong, and the population felt repressed, then society wouldn't be able to change, evolve and develop. He says that nothing is good indefinitely, and we must be free to criticise the way things are. By challenging and sometimes breaking the law, we ensure that society doesn't stagnate. He argues that the behaviour of some criminals, let's use the example of those engaging in criminal damage, or rioting as part of the civil rights movement against racial segregation in 1960s America, are only anticipating future morality. They are taking a step towards what will be. So breaking the law helps to prepare the way for change and acts as a beacon of light that helps us to shape new collective sentiments. If we have the freedom to look forward, to be idealistic, and to improve society, he also says that the same originality will be open to those to engage in criminality. So crime goes hand in hand with the freedoms that any healthy society needs to remain so. Some criminals break the law to improve society, and some do it for selfish reasons. But that's just part of the natural and normal part of things. Therefore, in his rules of sociological method, crime, at a tolerable level, isn't pathological at all, and as such, punishment shouldn't be designed to cure it. Crime is functional, as it reminds the majority about what's acceptable and unacceptable. So it helps to bind us together by reaffirming the collective conscience, and in doing so, it promotes social solidarity. A criminal trial or degradation ceremony was an essential part of that process. Now we can turn our attention to the Division of Labour and Society, 1893. Here he attempted to explain that as societies develop, they tend to become more prone to crime, and this had a certain inevitability about it. For example, in a less developed society like the ones that existed before industrialisation, there was a simple division of labour. Our economic roles were passed down the generations, say from father to son. So there wasn't the aggressive competition that we see today. People didn't have civil rights, and this prevented them from experiencing geographical mobility, because they were tied to the land by powerful obligations. Therefore, where you were born was probably where you died, and this prevented the development of contradictory ideas that might have challenged the traditional orthodoxy. So the people in the villages and hamlets had a similar experience and outlook on life. Add to this the powerful influence of religion, and you have what Durkheim referred to as mechanical solidarity. Mechanical solidarity was a form of social cement which was strong in that it bound people together to form a stable society. A society bound together by mechanical solidarity was one where norms and values were widely shared. All this has consequences for crime and deviance, because Durkheim is clearly suggesting that the conscience collective was acting in a way to prevent high crime rates. He then develops this argument further by saying that as industrialisation occurs, the division of labour becomes far more complex. Economic roles are differentiated and allocated on a competitive basis. We experience geographical and social mobility, we urbanise, and life in general becomes more impersonal. The influence of religious morality and the guidelines it produces also have less control over us, and taken together, one might argue that this is a recipe for higher levels of crime and deviance. We are not bound together to the same degree, and shared norms and values are weaker. In fact, for Durkheim, we are bound together more by shared economic interdependence rather than shared norms and values. Although he had a fairly optimistic view about the future, in that he thought that we would come to appreciate each other for the economic roles we perform, and how this would benefit us all, he did describe this type of society as one characterised by organic solidarity. Here then, the social cement is much more brittle and vulnerable to fracture. This could result in anomie, a kind of normlessness, where social norms were unclear, vague, or they simply weren't strong enough to prevent crime, deviance and conflict from occurring. Therefore, mechanical and organic solidarity and anomie are all useful in explaining Durkheim's views on crime and deviance. Now for a few criticisms. As a macro-sociologist, he seemed overly focused on the big picture and the social functions of crime. As such, he didn't give enough attention to the individual experience of crime, the victimology. The dysfunctions are only noted once the rate of crime becomes pathological. For interpretativists, the Durkheimian view ignores the social actor's first-order constructs, why we act in the ways we do, and how we make sense of the social world. Also, crime could be seen to benefit the rich and powerful, as it justifies the control and repression of the working class or ethnic minorities. Finally, what use is all this for the examination? Well, here are 4 examples. Number 1. Durkheim can be used to explain the nature of order and social control. Number 2. Some questions might ask you about how to solve crime. So Durkheim can be used to say that unless crime is unusually high, we shouldn't try to solve crime, because it's perfectly normal. Other questions ask why crime occurs, and Durkheim can be used to explain this by making reference to the rules of sociological method. It's our circumstances, our history, and our genes. Durkheim could also be used to criticise those on the right, who desire a far more social control, deterrence and retribution, and other forms of penal repression. For Durkheim, this would lead society to stagnate. It just wouldn't evolve or develop.